Okay, so let's move on to the to kind of learning a bit more about what is social research. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think is social research? You can just unmute your mics and talk to us. Would anyone like to take a shot at this? What is social research according to you?
You could even put it in the chat box if that's easier, whatever method you prefer. Chat box or, unmute and just don't be shy.
No one? I thought we are all like interested in knowing and doing social research. We've all had some exposure to social research. So what according to you comprises social research? There is no right or wrong answer unless you're way far off. But anyone would like to take a shot at this?
Daniel says at its simplest form, it's research involving people.
Okay. All right. Are there any other elements to it? I think there are some responses in the chat. Research related to human behaviors, right? Gathering data from people versus directly from the environment. Okay. Right.
Studying and understanding people in relation with other variables.
Right. Excellent. These are all excellent responses. So, are there any more?
Issues related to communities. Oh, wow. Research conducted by social scientists to understand social phenomena. So lots of responses.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Brilliant. Right. So, social research, like all of you know, involves people. Obviously, it has the word social in it. It's a form of inquiry that is systematic in nature. And what do we mean by systematic? Would anyone like to try that out? What do you mean by systematic inquiry? Structured. Yeah, that's right. It's structured, it's scientific, it's logical and empirical in nature. It's process driven. That's correct. Properly designed. Anyone else? Okay, so primarily there are two kinds of inquiries that one could have, very broadly speaking, and these two are deductive and inductive research. So has anyone come across these terms? Would you know what deductive means and how is it different from inductive research? Anyone can give an example of deductive versus inductive? Okay, so deductive research is basically hypothesis driven. You have an idea, you have a hypothesis when you begin your research and you kind of test that hypothesis out. Inductive, on the other hand, is the other way around. It's more descriptive. It's not based on a preconceived idea or hypothesis. It kind of moves from bottom up, like you use a grounded theory approach and you kind of build on the research or the question that you're interested in. So one example of deductive research that you can think of from your study, would anyone like to give it a try? A hypothesis-driven kind of question that you may have thought about or come across? No? Okay, so let me give you an example. So if you hypothesize that grazing of pasture lands decreases invertebrate diversity. Now I'm giving you an example that's kind of ecological in nature, partly, but you're free to give me other examples. So this is to get us going. So let's hypothesize that grazing of pasture lands decreases invertebrate diversity. You could select several similar small areas of pasture land, subject them to certain levels of grazing, monitor how that affects insect diversity, invertebrate diversity, and then measure these changes. So what are you doing? You have a hypothesis. You say that an X input will cause a Y response. And then you have kind of processes and designs in place to measure and monitor this change. Have you ever come across anything like this when you're doing social research? Have you ever done any kind of deductive social research, or could you think of examples where it could be employed? Right. Yeah. Yes, that could be a hypothesis. The main motivation for poaching among poachers is financial motivation. Anyone else would like to type? Let's say we are measuring the efficacy of conservation programs. So you have an area and you want to know whether a conservation program is working. Could that be, how would you frame it if you wanted to, propose a hypothesis and use a deductive framework for it? Yeah, attitudes towards wolves is driven by losses of livestock. Yeah, correct. That's an example of deductive inquiry. What about inductive inquiry? Any examples? Since you've all used various methods to do your social research. Okay, Daniel says, people who have experienced brown bear attacks are the ones who are afraid of bear's moves. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a great hypothesis to have. Excellent. Harvesting wheat farm is the cause of Great Indian bustard mortality. Okay, excellent. Fantastic. What about inductive? Could anyone give examples of inductive research? No one? Okay, well, a lot of my research, I can speak from my experience, was inductive in nature, where I didn't have a preconceived hypothesis about what was changing and how that was changing. Instead, I kind of had a lot of descriptive data coming in. So, for example, we looked at how values for wildlife differ depending on what does folklore tell us about the different values that people have towards animals. That sort of inductive inquiry. Uh, have you guys also done this kind of research which has involved inductive inquiry? Considering the main reason of livestock mortality among herders in a region, could it be something to? Yeah, that could be an inductive inquiry. That's true. Anyone else? Yes, inductive has no prior hypothesis. If it has a hypothesis, typically that would be deductive inquiry. Assessing people's livelihoods in an area, role of culture and wildlife conservation. Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. Anyone else would like to give it a shot? Assessing attitudes towards onagers. Yeah, exactly. Fantastic. So basically, data collection is guided by a set of broad questions or issues, and the data are used to generate a theory, like I said, or it could be used to generate a hypothesis too, once sufficient evidence has been gathered. And the most extreme form of inductive research is called grounded theory that I was talking about, where data is gathered on a particular issue or situation with a completely open mind. Like you just say, let me go and see what's out there, and then, kind of record that information and build something out of that. So you go in kind of with a blank slate in that sense. And you kind of avoid being influenced avoid influencing the findings, or you avoid bringing in your research biases. So this is kind of we are kind of trying to break down what social research comprises. So we've said that it's a systematic inquiry that's logical and empirical in nature. It's scientific, of course. There are two ways of doing it: predominantly deductive and inductive research, and this should be fairly easy. Could you give me examples of qualitative research? I am guessing most of you know what qualitative research is. So any examples? Thanks, Nilofer. Thanks, Aliana. What are the activities of livestock guarding in an area? Yeah, correct. That's inductive. What is an example of a qualitative research? Anyone? I've done interviews. Helena says I've done interviews of hunters of wolves at the Arctic Circle, for example, to find out their motivation. But this was a hypothesis-based, more survey. This, of course, was no retaliation issue like snow leopards, very different situation. No livestock in that environment, but large caribou herds and management stage. Right, qualitative, group discussions, unstructured interviews, focus group discussions. Descriptive statistics stem from questionnaires. Okay, qualitative is descriptive. Qualitative, understanding the motivations of landowners to join a biodiversity program. Sure. Okay, so essentially qualitative is where you kind of, you have more descriptive parameters. The way you go about analyzing the data involves a lot of descriptions, not so much a use of statistics or any kind of quantification per se, or very minimal quantification. So it typically like the kind of stuff we do with ethnographic research, where you might go into an area, you might stay with one family and kind of try to understand their way of life and how they, what kind of a relationship they have with their livestock, for example. That would be an example of qualitative research. Quantitative, on the other hand, would be any kind of quantification. So quantitative could be with statistics, numbers, modeling, more kind of algorithm based, those kind of things. And anyone who could give me an example of quantitative social research? A quick example? Pause interviews, SEM, number livestock lots. Yeah, correct. Excellent. So qualitative need not always be, verbal. It could also be based on pictures. You're trying to analyze pictures, for example. That could also be qualitative. It need not be only interviews. It could even be audio recording. It could be, looking at archival searches and things like that. Examples of quantitative research, it typically has scales and scores, those kind of things. Specific answers, that's correct. Specific, and there are, for example, you might have heard of the Likert scale that goes from, say, strongly agree to strongly disagree. I like having wolves. Do you strongly agree with the statement or strongly disagree? So that's kind of an example of, is it a qualitative or a quantitative method? What is Likert? Quantitative, the relation between the income of local communities and the tendency for poaching. Okay, excellent. Right. So I think we are fairly clear on what we mean by qualitative and quantitative research. Now there are multiple ways of going about this. You can have spatial research where you're comparing different areas around the same time period, or you could have a temporal research, which is sort of like a long-term research that you go, you do your research now and say 10 years down the line in the exact same area, which could be quantitative or qualitative in nature, right? So anyone who can give me an example of a spatial research that they have done? Have you kind of compared different areas, or have you done any kind of temporal research that has looked at like a long-term data set, kind of gone back in time from, before this date and after this date, that sort of thing? Have you guys had any experience in these things? Interview-based occupancy modeling, more temporal, coming back to a location over years. All right. Could you elaborate on that, Aliana? What kind of research was it?
So looking at disease spread and coming back and seeing how that might change in different seasons and then different years depending on treatment protocols.
Okay, excellent. Anyone else? Magnitude of conflict in Northeast. All right. So have you looked at this over time, Iftikhar? Or different seasons? Iftikhar, you can unmute your mic and tell us what you think. We studied the level of human-wildlife conflict in 4 different sites across. We also considered Session, right? Okay, good. All right, so we kind of have a understanding of, no problem, Iftika. Is that, time series of time? What is LOT devices? Around the world, collecting data, electronic data. Okay, so we have a fairly decent understanding of the different aspects of social research. And just to give you a very, very brief history, literally a one-line history, is that a lot of research regarding human dimensions, especially in the context of conservation, mainly gained momentum around the 1980s and has been growing exponentially since. So it was sort of in the late 20th century that social research for conservation was really started being taken more seriously. This is one definition of social research. As you can see, the use of controlled inquiry to find, describe, understand, explain, evaluate, and change patterns or regularities in social life. This is a definition by Blakey. By the way, a lot of what we are talking about in this lecture is influenced by Helena Norberg's book, Helen Newing's book called Conservation Social Science Perspective. We can share that book with you and the reference with you later. Right, so let's move on to the next bit. So we've kind of covered what social research is. Now, let's move on to the first paper that we read, Adams 2004. Would anyone like to summarize kind of the main points or at least a few points? Have you guys read the paper? What was the paper about? What does Adams have to say about conservation? Anyone? Okay. Anyone else? Traditional practices? Could you elaborate, Raza? Nobody? I hope you guys have read the paper.
So I guess, it's talking about the linkage between biodiversity and poverty and,
Okay.
how those influence each other and how we can address them, or approaches to addressing them, whether it's like combined, addressing both at the same time or one or the other, and how that affects each, I guess.
Okay. Okay. All right. So what are the 4 different kinds of sort of the typologies that he gives with regards to poverty and biodiversity conservation? Do you guys recollect anything at all? What are the 4 different categories? No? Well, you can unmute your mics and say something if you feel like, but let me give you a quick summary of what the paper was about. So there are, what Adam says is there are typically 4 categories or 4 kinds of links between poverty and biodiversity conservation, or rather how, conservationists approach poverty. One is there is a view within the conservation community that poverty is separate from conservation, and therefore they can both they can both exist parallelly. They are completely separate realms, and conservation has nothing to do with poverty. Conservation need not address that goal at all. A typical example of this would be protected area network, where the priority of a conservation organization might be just conservation without really benefiting the community in any way. Would someone like to say something? All right. The next one is where they say poverty is an impediment to conservation. Would you like to give an example of that? Of a view that thinks that poverty is a constraint to conservation, and what would be an example of that? No?
Yes, in areas that are in poverty might be more inclined to hunt species that are technically protected because they need food.
Right.
Or to make money for themselves to be able to buy necessities.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Other responses in the chat? Poverty constraints biodiversity, conservation shouldn't negatively. Yes, correct. Right. So the next, the third category is talks about how conservation must not aggravate poverty. What could be an example of that? So essentially, it's a status quo. You're not helping alleviate poverty, but you're not making it worse. Would you guys think of an example of a conservation model that works around this kind of mindset? So any organization that has any kind of codes of conduct or a social impact assessment or any kind of a monitoring mechanism to test how this is impacting local people or local communities where they have these programs would kind of be an example of this particular category. Basically, their mandate is to do conservation, but not make things worse for people. The fourth category is conservation must actively reduce poverty. And the reason for this is that both of them, the well-being of both is tied, and therefore it is important that conservation addresses poverty. So this could mean any kind of income generation activities or any kind of benefits that conservation derives are shared with the local community. So these are the four categories. My question to you is, if you have read the paper, why do you think this kind of classification is important and why is it relevant in our context? Yeah, like Justine said, one example of conservation reducing poverty would be any kind of livelihoods programs. Does this matter at all, this kind of distinction, or are we just, there is no need for these kind of distinctions? Do you think it is important to explore these links? Don't be shy. Local communities are the main stakeholders in any conservation efforts. So you think it is important to have these distinctions, Ritika? Is that what you're saying? Okay, all right. Anyone else? Why do you think it is important to explore the link between poverty and biodiversity? And how is that even relevant to what we are talking about? It could directly affect the effectiveness of conservation effort. People, livelihood matters. Matters as people's attitudes towards conservation will be changed. Conservation often interconnects with development. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we are, a lot of us work on various conservation issues, and we've been trained differently. Some of us have been trained to look at ecology. Some of us have been trained to look at the social aspects. Many of us are working at the intersection of the two. And the thing is, conservation does not happen in a bubble. It is a part of society, and therefore people are going to be, influenced and affected by the actions that we take as conservationists. We can also be at the receiving end of this conservation. We might be the beneficiaries of a particular conservation enterprise, right? So there's a lot of give and take that happens between people and various interventions and and the larger community, conservation community as well. So it's very important to have these sort of distinctions, because that sort of tells us and helps us identify the mindset with which one is implementing a particular program. Whether we are trying to, reduce poverty. If we are trying to reduce poverty, we will have a different set of goals and a different set of activities. If we are trying to maintain status quo, we'll focus on different kinds of activities. If we think that poverty and conservation do not cross or do not converge at all, we'll have a very different approach to conservation versus if we think that poverty can be an impediment to conservation. So Zulma, have I missed any responses? Let me just see.
Yes, I do.
Increased participation.
I said,
Yeah. What
I
did
said
you say?
conservation bring a little bit of restriction as well, and also
Right.
opportunities. In Wakhan National Park, the national park was declared in 2014. In Wakhan, we want people to bring some restriction on livestock grazing. But on the other side, conservation of Wakhan means a little bit of opportunities for community as local rangers have been hired and conservation created new jobs in the area. So it's a little bit of restriction and also job opportunities. So that's why it's linked with the livelihood of local communities.
Helena says, yes, very important. Conservation can't work in the long term and be as relevant without local community involvement and feedback. Yes. Have I missed any responses? I don't think so. If anyone has anything to say, please do say. What did you think of this paper? Did you like it? Do you disagree with it? Do you think, was it an eye-opener? Like the first time I read it, I was very fascinated by this distinction. This was like nearly, I don't know now, 10, 12 years ago is when I read this paper, and it was just so mind-blowing for me to know that actually we can distinguish these things in various ways. We can cut the pie in various ways. Conservation brings a little bit of restriction, yeah. You said that already. I'll make sure to reread it. Justine. All right. Economic setup of local communities might decide the direction of conservation approach. The economic well-being of the communities will play an important role. Shaki says ownership to boost conservation. That's right. Excellent. All right. So, we've kind of addressed what social research is. I'm guessing we are more or less clear with that, especially since we have already used this for our research. Let's quickly move on to the next bit.